Ferrari, McLaren, and Porsche. These are the three car companies that make up the automotive world's holy trinity. In racing, these are some of the most competitive companies of all time, competing at the very upper echelons of motorsport. And over the decades, they have also produced some of the most impressive road cars of all time. Now, this Holy Trinity name really came about with their last generation of hypercars that came out in the mid-2010s. The LaFerrai, the P1, and the 918. Three ultra high-performance, low-production hypercars from three of the most legendary manufacturers, all coming out at the same time and sharing common technology. This was truly a unique moment, but to build up just how special these cars are, I want to talk through many of the other hypercars that these manufacturers have built that led up to this point. And we'll start back in the 1980s. Now, the 1980s was an interesting time for all car companies. Automakers were just starting to innovate again after basically being sent back to the Stone Age with the emissions, fuel economy, and safety regulations that came out in the 1970s. And the first car company to come out with a new hypercar during this period was Ferrari, with the introduction of the 288 GTO in 1984. It was based on another model in Ferrari's lineup, the 308, but it was significantly lighter, wider, and more powerful. Now, at least part of the reason that Ferrari decided to build this car was to comply with homologation requirements for the legendary racing series Group B. Now, the 288 GTO was a very special car for a variety of reasons. One of which is it was one of the earliest applications of Ferrari taking what it had learned about turbocharged engines in F1 and applying it to a road car. It was also built in very low numbers, with around only 270 ever being produced. And as a general rule, Ferrari reserves the GTO nameplate for only its very most special road cars. Another car with its roots in Group B rally racing that came out during this time was the Porsche 959. Now, many people's reaction to seeing the 959 is thinking that it kind of just looks like a 911 with a body kit, but it is truly much more than just that. It was an extremely advanced car for its time, and it pioneered advancements such as active suspension, TPMS, and was one of the earliest applications of all-wheel drive in an ultra high-performance setting. It also shared a similar ethos to one of Porsche's newest products in the 911 Dakar by being a street-legal rally car. The thing is, with the 959, it just came out 40 years ago, and at the time was one of the fastest cars in the world. And lastly, just to round out this 1980s segment, we are going to double dip on Ferrari and talk about the 1987 Ferrari F40. Similar to the 288 GTO, the F40 also used a turbocharged V8 engine, and its body was designed by the legendary coach builder Pininfarina. And maybe what the F40 was best known for was that it was the last car that had the personal approval of Enzo Ferrari. Now we're going to transition to the 1990s, and this is where things start getting really serious. Automakers, especially at the very high end, had figured out how to make big power again, but regulations were still loose enough that the ways that they applied this power could truly be in some ludicrous ways. And I think the car that best exemplifies the advancements that were being made during this time was the 1992 McLaren F1. Now, the F1's kind of claim to fame in popular culture was that at the time it was the world's fastest production car, but the F1 is a lot more than just a fast car. For example, there's the seating position, which literally places you in the center of the car. And to your right, you have a manual transmission that is connected to a 600 horsepower, naturally aspirated V12 that is literally sitting in a gold-plated engine bay. And I am certainly not the only one who admires just how special of a car this is, because it is one of the most valuable production cars of all time. They pretty rarely change hands, but when they do, a McLaren F1 sells for upwards of $20 million. Another car from the 1990s that I think is sometimes outshined by the F1 is the Ferrari F50. Ferrari claimed at the time when this car came out, its intent was to provide a driving experience that was as similar to an F1 car for the street as possible. As such, it was powered by a naturally aspirated V12 that was derived from Ferrari's 1990 F1 car, and it lacked just about any type of creature comfort or safety features in pursuit of all-out performance. For example, it didn't even feature power steering or anti-lock brakes. Looking back though, the F50 is kind of outshined, yes, by the F1, but also by the F40 that came before it. But I do think it is fair to say that the F50 was the last truly analog hypercar that Ferrari would ever produce. Now, moving into the 2000s, this is kind of where things begin to change. Manufacturers were still able to use big, powerful engines, but more and more systems within the car were starting to be controlled by computers. And I think a vehicle that can really help highlight this contrast was Ferrari's next hypercar after the F50, the 2002 Ferrari Enzo. Now, a vehicle that is named after the founder of the company certainly has to be special, and the Enzo is just that. It ushered in a new generation of Ferrari V12 engines, and it was the first Ferrari hypercar not to feature a manual transmission. Instead, it had the F1 gearbox, which is a paddle shift automated manual. And while it didn't feature a massive wing like the F50, the Enzo had active aerodynamics that helped it produce a tremendous amount of downforce. Now, for what many people consider to be truly the last analog hypercar, there is the 2004 Porsche Carrera GT. Now, there are a few different things that make the Carrera GT so special. Mainly, its F1-derived 5.7-liter V10, its manual transmission, open top, and lack of just about any type of driving aid. Now, all of that power and lack of driving aids did end up leading to some very high-profile crashes and eventually lawsuits, but still, the Carrera GT is an extremely sought-after vehicle. Now, for the last of our 2000s hypercars, there is the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren. This car was a joint venture after Mercedes purchased a stake in McLaren. And if I'm being honest, it's probably one of the cars that interests me the least on this list. While it does feature a beautiful design, I think its kind of lack of a unique engine and conventional automatic transmission just means it doesn't really stack up favorably against the rest of these cars. Now, as we progress into the 2010s, technology will again take a massive leap forward. Dual clutch transmissions have completely replaced the manual on the high end of the performance car market, and there is a new technology that all of this next generation of hypercars will feature: electrification. And it is kind of funny because over the years, all of these different automakers took pretty different paths to get this high level of performance out of their cars. But in the stretch of just a few years, all of these car companies will come out with their new flagship, and they will all feature hybrid powertrains. So the similarities shared between these three cars, plus the fact that they all came out at the same time, combined with the rich history of these three automakers, is why this generation of kind of mid-2010s hypercars are referred to as the Holy Trinity. And the first car that we will start with is the Ferrari LaFerrai. And this car literally translates to the Ferrari. And if you kind of ask Ferrari what their intention was with this car, they will tell you that it is intended to be the definitive Ferrari. What this car does do is combine a naturally aspirated 800 horsepower V12 with an electric motor to achieve a combined output of 950 horsepower. And it also shares in the history of the Ferrari hypercars that have come before it by incorporating Ferrari's F1 technology into their road cars. Another member of this Holy Trinity that applies F1-derived technology to a street car is the McLaren P1. And it is similar to the LaFerrai in that it combines a super powerful gas engine with an electric motor. In this case, that gas engine is a 3.8-liter twin turbocharged V8. And out of this trio of hypercars, in my opinion at least, I think the P1 was probably the car that was the least well received. Because in true McLaren fashion, just a few years later, they would come out with another special edition with comparable performance to the P1, but at a much lower price point in the form of the Senna. And the last member of this holy trinity is the Porsche 918. Now, out of this trio, the 918 is probably the car that you could make the strongest argument for using every day. It has a relatively well-appointed interior, it has slightly more conservative styling than some of these other cars, and it even has 12 miles of all-electric range. But to be completely honest, absolutely no one is driving their 918 every day. Like the other two cars in this group, the 918 features a hybrid powertrain. The internal combustion engine is a 4.6-liter naturally aspirated V8 that makes around 600 horsepower, but it is assisted by two electric motors that also add an additional 280 horsepower. But it does ultimately mean that this is the least powerful model out of this group. So to zoom back out, all of these cars coming out within such a short window and sharing so much common technology is part of what made this period so unique. But it does seem like this could potentially be happening all over again. There's already some pretty credible rumors that Ferrari is working on their next generation hypercar. Porsche has showed off their Mission X concept, which is full electric. That would be a little bit of a disappointment. But there's also speculation that they could be working on a new GT1. And there's also rumblings that McLaren could be joining in as well. And even though these cars are so beyond attainable, they only sell to the elite of the elite, it is really cool to see these storied automakers duking it out at the very high end of the performance car market.